A nice slow ride into the abyss.
Always the best way to go.
Thank you for joining me for this video. I'm here with my friend Scott Yenor. I believe for the second time that we've done this because you have written another marvelous piece, and I thought it would be good for us to talk about it. If you're not familiar with Scott, he is professor of political science at Boise State University. He's a senior director of state coalitions at the Claremont Institute, and the author most recently of The Recovery of Family Life, Exposing the Limits of Modern Ideologies, and that's through Baylor University Press. So Scott, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me on, Jared. It's a pleasure to be here.
We could talk about several things. I'm sure you'll be up here in Moscow again shortly, and we'll be able to collaborate more. But the topic of conversation today is this piece you wrote at First Things. I believe it was this month still. Was it early March that you wrote this?
Yes, it was in the March 2024 issue of First Things.
Okay, called Compulsory Feminism. And it jumped out to me. I was working through Aaron Renn's recent book, Life in Negative World. And of course, the question of kind of the egalitarian structure of our society comes up in that particular book. And I was thinking through those very thoughts when your piece came across my wire. And I thought, you know, we need to hit this again. We need to be reminded about the structure of our own society, this new constitution that you're talking about. And if we're going to be sons of Issachar who know the times, we really do have to reassess where we're at. And after doing so, think through what in the world are we supposed to do about it. So thus this conversation. So thanks for joining me. I thought maybe could you start by just giving us a 10,000-foot view of the article itself? Like what's the basic point you're making, the basic structure of your argumentation?
Yeah, the original title of the piece was How the Civil Rights Act Undermines the Family. And it was an attempt to get at the idea that our reigning ideas of civil rights attack central assumptions of family life. And I identified in the piece three of these assumptions. The first, the economic basis of the family, which is the assumption that was prevalent before the Civil Rights Act, so before 1964, that men have different roles than women, and the economy needs to be structured so that men can play their roles within the family. And the old idea was that men would earn what was called a family wage. And in other words, they'd be paid a little bit more than single men. Married men with families would be paid a little bit more than single men or single women because they had more responsibilities and needed to be able to execute those responsibilities. So the family wage was somewhat common, pretty common, before it was made illegal under the Equal Pay Act, and we got a cliche out of the Equal Pay Act, equal pay for equal work. Well, equal pay for equal work destroys the economic basis for a family wage. And that's something that conservatives don't really acknowledge, but it's there, and it's an element of this civil rights regime. The second element of the civil rights regime is that the state and ultimately culture and businesses are not allowed to think that men and women play different roles within the family and act on the basis of that thought. They can't do the action, they can't do the thinking. And in fact, they have to actively seek to deconstruct the idea that men and women might do different things in life through an anti-stereotyping imperative that became sewn into the civil rights apparatus. And the third element of it was the sexual harassment regime, which I think grows naturally out of the civil rights regime. And this sexual harassment regime complicates the sexual dance between men and women, unmarried, forces businesses to take a proactive role in deconstructing their environment within their businesses so that no one can accuse them of sexual harassment or creating a hostile work environment. And this is also, I think, complicated, as I say, the sexual dance between men and women. So the civil rights regime undermines the economic basis, the social roles, and the sexual dance. And obviously, there are other things that contribute to making family life more difficult in the modern world. Not all of them are traceable to the civil rights laws. No-fault divorce would be another one. The deregulation of obscenity is another one. But conservatives ignore at their peril the role that the civil rights regime plays in complicating family life. That's my basic argument.
Okay. Now, in this civil rights regime, Civil Rights Act, because of its very language, constitutes a new constitution that makes the former way of operating categorically illegal. Is that right? And if it's right, take us back and talk about life before the Civil Rights Act. And I have more questions, but I'll leave it just there for now.
Yeah, so the Civil Rights Act does more than just attack sex discrimination. It attacks discrimination based on race, ethnicity, national origin, and sex. And stamping out, the idea of stamping out private discrimination is the imperative that the civil rights regime generally, the Civil Rights Constitution generally leaves for the government. And great power to stamp out discrimination is transferred ultimately to those who will oversee the economy, education, and all other aspects of human life. And that commission is called the Equal Opportunity and Employment Commission, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, EEOC. And that entity of government is not really accountable to the voters. It's only very indirectly accountable to the elected officials. People on that commission serve very long terms, and they're not removable except for cause. And they end up being the regulators of human life. So the Civil Rights Act has been called by libertarian legal theorist David Epstein, not David Epstein, Epstein, in a book on the Civil Rights Act in the 1980s. It was called the act that ate the Constitution. And in other words, the enforcement of this act has none of the judicial and separation of powers limits that are set on the normal lawmaking constitution. And so it created a whole new parallel institution. I'm talking about like one slice of that new constitution as it relates to sex discrimination and its effect on the family. Others have talked more broadly about how the Civil Rights Act creates a new constitution. I think the best popular book in that respect is Christopher Caldwell's Age of Entitlement from a couple years ago that really put the issue on the map. But there's been a few more books that have been out recently on that as well. Anyways, that's the basic argument. The Civil Rights Act created a new bureaucratic regime that was already there, but that expanded the powers of that new bureaucratic regime and gave it moral authority that has allowed it to govern not only the legal apparatus, but also the culture. And that's where its power lies.
Okay. Let's try to make this tangible. We're under compulsory feminism because of this Civil Rights Act and regarding to this small slice of sex that you're talking about. Basically, we have fundamental problems with the legal structure post that date, post the Civil Rights Act back there in the 60s. Okay, what is it now? Can you go granular and give us an example? I believe you at the end of the article, it was a very strong case that basically the new sexual constitution basically outlaws at least certain dimensions or practices of the former constitution. So can you make that very tangible as to the generation that's growing up now? You have say millennials that have never known life any other way. Xers probably, for that matter, have never known life any other way. The boomers can remember a day when things were different. Explain to the Xers and the millennials, what is it now that you cannot do because of this particular legislation or this particular Civil Rights Act? Yeah.
So let's use a couple of court cases, to illustrate this point. Martin Marietta had a practice. They were a defense contractor. They had a practice of not hiring mothers of young children in their manufacturing facility, or really, in their company as a whole. And they didn't do that. They didn't hire young mothers because they did not want to break up the bond between mothers and children. They did not want to contribute to that. And a mother, applied for a job. She was like kind of ruled out. She sued, and under the guidance of the 64 Civil Rights Act, Section 7, governing employment practices, Martin Marietta was, found liable. Like they had to change their employment practice. And this bubbles down into every employer. If you have an employer over a certain number of employees, the number is probably 15 if you have a business, you cannot discriminate in your hiring practices because you believe that it is best to have mothers taking care of children. And in fact, you can't even offer different workplace accommodations for mothers with young children if you don't also offer them to fathers with young children. So let's say you're a traditional employer and you have a young mother working as an editor and you allow her to work remotely, but no one else is allowed to work remotely. Well, ultimately, that's a civil rights violation if you're over a certain size. You have to conform to the idea that you have a sexless workplace because everything outside the workplace is also sexless. And that's the fundamental idea that the Civil Rights Act does not allow any enterprise outside of churches to support an idea of sex and sex roles in their practices. If you do, you run up against the Civil Rights Act.
Civil Rights Act is trans.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, it's asexual. I don't want to say it's trans. Trans is like the next step in the Civil Rights Act, but it would require an argument to say what you said.
Yeah, but I mean, it's removed any kind of materiality to sex, or it's erased it from the question and pretend. I said that because of your sexless idea. Well, if you come up with a category of sexless, well, then then it's up to a man to fill it with kind of whatever he wants.
And that's the context in which the Supreme Court radicalized the Civil Rights Act in the recent trans decision, the Bostock decision, right, where they said if you cannot discriminate on the basis of sex, well, you can't discriminate on the basis that sex is binary or that sex is not changeable. So yeah, they did. It just went a step further than anyone, I think at the time contemplated. But yes.
Okay, so that seems very clear now. We understand at least an example of what could have been done or what was done before, which was perfectly permissible, an acknowledgement of the family, but indeed it was a discrimination. It was somebody acknowledging male and female. It was acknowledging the family. It was acknowledging a young mother, and that was having an impact on who one would employ and how one would be employed. And that's something that, according to the civil rights legislation, simply can't be done anymore. It's outlawed now. Now, you hit these three already, but I think the way that you demonstrate in your article the three ambitions of this Civil Rights Act, I'd like you to just highlight them one more time. So we understand the general concept. You're now living under compulsory feminism because of this Civil Rights Act. And what are these three ambitions that you see? Just restate them for us.
The first is to, I'll say, force mothers into the workplace through equal pay for equal work. The second is to erase stereotypes from not only education institutions, but from any private institutions, stereotypes pointing men and women toward different destinies within the family. And then the third is the sexual harassment idea, where the workplace needs to be re-engineered so that no minority, but in this case women, feels a hostile work environment is present, and a hostile work environment will be determined by what they think, and it can include simply stating the idea that men and women are different. And so economic equality, anti-stereotype, sex harassment are the three elements of.
Okay, and the example you gave falls clearly into the first category. This was an economic reality. Go ahead and spell out the second one again for us a little bit. The stereotypes, of course. The younger generations are going to hear stereotypes, and they're going to say, Scott Yenor advocating stereotypes. So you're going to have to let's spell out what was done before along this second point, and what can no longer be done now.
Yeah, I think the best way of illustrating that second point is through the Virginia Military Institute case, the VMI case, from the mid-90s. It was very common in the United States to have sex-segregated education because it was thought men and women, or excuse me, boys and girls, face different challenges in the classroom and may, in some ways, be pointing toward different destinies after education. VMI was an all-boys military school where they practice a very confrontational mode of teaching the kids, very challenging. And it was thought that boys needed such challenging and such competition in order to be better educated. So the school was based on a stereotype, if you want to look at it like that boys have this kind of need and respond better to it than girls do. Girls, in contrast, had like no state institution for the most part dedicated to their military preparation, because here's another stereotype. It's thought that men should serve in the military and women shouldn't serve in the military. So under the VMI, so some girls asked for admission into VMI. They were denied ipso facto because of their admission policies. And the court threw out VMI's admission policies, saying that you can keep your old educational practices if some girls want to have that kind of education practices. It's only a stereotype that leads you to think that they wouldn't like it or wouldn't benefit or wouldn't thrive under it. So VMI had to change its practices. And I guess, within 5 years, they had abandoned their entire curriculum, because the entire curriculum was, of course, based on stereotypes. And in order to allow the girls who did not like the confrontational education as much as the boys did, in order to get them to thrive, they had to change the entire orientation of the school. And so VMI is not what VMI was. So like sex-segregated education, very common before the Civil Rights Act, almost illegal after the Civil Rights Act. And I think that would be a good way of illustrating the difference. I mean, there's other things that I could put on the same category. There used to be state laws that made men the executor of the estates of their children should their children die. And those laws were all thrown out because it was thought that those laws were based on the stereotype that men are more responsible than women, or men are generally in charge of family finances instead of women. So those laws went the way of the dodo bird too.
Okay, so let's say I'm tracking with you here. We're under compulsory feminism. There's a new constitution, essentially a new sexual constitution that outlaws the former way of life. Evidence number one in our economic relationships, and the fact that I'm running a coffee shop and in walks a new mother with triplets, and I can't consider her state in life any longer post this civil rights legislation. That makes good sense to me. And then the second one about stereotypes, and even teleology came into mind, right? What are men for? What are women for? And you have the Virginia Military Institute, very clear example there. And so I'm buying that as well. You say the third here is that now it's inevitable that basically the government is kind of policing the male-female dance or something like that. I think this is where your third point comes. But let's say that one's just kind of, yeah, basically I agree with you, but now I know there's going to be a lot of sexual misconduct in the workplace, and it's got to be regulated somehow. I don't like it as a conservative person, but I don't find it to be that big of a deal. Can you demonstrate or reiterate just how big of a deal this third ambition of the civil rights new sexual constitution is?
Yeah, I mean, so what you say is partly right, I think. That is, under all sexual constitutions, or I should say under the old sexual constitution, men who womanized at work could be under real problems. They could have real problems. They might be fired if they were horsing around with their secretary, because it was thought to reflect badly on the company. And I'm not saying that every company had a morality clause and there might have been double standards for high performers or low performers, but you can imagine also female employees being somewhat policed in how they dress. That is, too provocative would be bad. And under the new regime, well, as long as you tell HR that you're having an affair with your secretary, and not like threatening to fire her if she doesn't, grant you sexual favors or go on a date with you, um, uh, you can't be released. Like there's an HR process, and in fact, maybe this is the best way of putting this whole point. Before the Civil Rights Act, no human resources departments, personnel departments dealing basically with contracts, making sure everyone gets paid on time, and that. After the Civil Rights Act, especially after a generation of the Civil Rights Act, there's HR departments, there's training, there's respectful workforce training, there's respectful, there's loads of policies with people to execute those policies so that we can regulate how everyone at work relates to one another. This is done racially, but it's also done, and I think it's more important, in the sphere of sexual relations within the workplace. I think each of them had ways of dealing with the problems. As I say, informally, bosses would police their employees in the old days. Now, HR polices the employees, including the boss. And that's the big, I think, shift in how the new modern workplace operates under the civil rights regime. And I think one of the more controversial things that I argue in there is that it makes sense to me that the sexual harassment regime grows naturally out of the sexual discrimination regime. I think conservatives have for a long time tried to drive a wedge between those two things and say civil rights good, harassment law is bad. But I think actually they grow out of one another. And here's why. Discrimination is about hiring. You can hire someone and then make their life miserable. You can create a hostile working environment in order to get rid of people that you don't want. So it makes sense that if you're not allowed to discriminate, you're not allowed to allow a hostile work environment to grow up under your watch, because that would just be a backdoor way of accomplishing the not hiring. So it makes sense that these two things go together. And so if you want to get rid of one, I think you have to kind of attack both of them at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I have at least two more questions in my head, and they go in a particular order. Let's see if I can keep to my promise and ask both of them. We'll see where it goes. The first is, now that you've established this, that we live under compulsory feminism, this new sexual constitution that outlaws our former way of life, which is, and that new sexual constitution is embedded in the civil rights legislation, and that one slice on discriminating based upon sex. And that particular civil rights legislation has these three ambitions, which seem to be manifestly true. Let's say I'm just a conservative and I live in a fairly conservative place still, a red state. Yes, I know that these things are true, particularly on this kind of national level, Scott. But I'm going to go to church, and I'm going to. I understand male headship in the home, and I'm going to operate that way. And my wife's got a side gig that she can work through the internet and not take her away from the kids that much. Maybe we're homeschooling or going some option like that. And, these things aren't, these structural realities, this compulsory feminism isn't really compelling me. It isn't requiring me to live in a feminist framework. What would you say to such a guy?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is more than an element of truth to that kind of critique. The regime that we have is not as totalitarian as it could be. It burdens traditional practices, but it does not outlaw them. It kind of creates these dominant structures if one wants to live a life outside of compulsory feminism, but it doesn't yet foreclose the possibility of living such lives. Your neighbors are going to be different. You're going to have fewer neighbors who hold to your point of view, but that doesn't mean, at least for now, that it is outlawed. There's no gulags into which people will be sent. There's only fines, loss of jobs. It could be worse. This is one of my favorite sayings. It could be worse, and it will be probably. And so, yeah, I think there is truth in what you say, but you also have to recognize, and here's a limit on it, like this is the leading edge where it would touch people, is that the civil rights regime shapes the way men and women see themselves. So increasingly, women see themselves as victims of discrimination, and they see men as those who discriminate. Now, I'm not saying, like, that's the self-perception that females have in our society under the Civil Rights Act and under the Civil Rights Constitution, because, well, of course, that's what it teaches. You should see discrimination everywhere. And if you don't see it, well, your consciousness hasn't yet been adequately raised in order to see all the ways in which you are being misshaped. So I think this traditional guy can expect his daughter, especially, to be vulnerable to these elements of our sexual constitution, this anti-discrimination regime, all over on internet, on social media. They're going to be an element of what your daughter, in this case, is imbibing in with the dominant culture. And men, in contrast, the institutions are not designed so that they can thrive, which doesn't mean that it's illegal for them to thrive, but they're not designed for them to thrive. And so you might be able to carve out ways in which to live a good life for now. And I don't deny that reality. But the way men and women interact and see one another will be shaped by the dominant culture. And I think that's the leading edge in which we will all be affected by this. Maybe you've seen, there was this article, I can't remember what British newspaper, I think it was the Financial Times. It was called "The New Global Gender Gap is Emerging." It was written in January. And in it, they had several countries where they had the political alignment of young single women, like from the 1980s till now. And in all of them, but especially prevalent in the United States and Great Britain, you see like there's been a small like leaning toward more liberals and conservatives in America among women until 2015, when it just like skyrocketed almost directly up. And men kind of gradually became slightly more conservative. Like that's the dominant civil rights regime shaping the minds of young generation. And I think that's the effect. I'm not saying it can't be countered, but that's the effect.
I would add to the guy, like, well, basically, if you're just going to be selfish and go find a little home on the range somewhere, then you can do a Hezekiah situation. Well, it won't happen in my day, so I'll be okay. But no, there is going to be a hegemony, and the hegemony, this idea it should be in accord with truth. It should be in accord with truth, goodness, and beauty, and it's manifestly not, and it's absolutely destroying our society. And the idea that you can somehow faithfully play on a feminist field is foolish. You just simply can't. You can't breathe in feminist air and then claim your family's going to survive and flourish and your people are going to flourish. And so you have rightly highlighted a fundamental problem that has to be rectified. Now shifting from the problem to solutions, we could have 17 more podcasts on this about how we would actually go about reformation, and hopefully some kind of reformation before a revolution, because from what I can tell, there is at least enough angst and frustration among the younger generation of men that I think it's absolutely time to fix this. I'm listening to the Fourth Turning right now. Fourth Turning is here, very interesting about the different levels. And the millennial generation, I think he marks as the heroes that are hopefully going to bring about some kind, lead through the Fourth Turning. And I think it would map on to what we're doing. I don't know. I know it could be worse, as you mentioned, but I think we're coming to some kind of full collapse here of the folly that we have been into with the rise of trans, and which I think is the implication of this civil rights legislation you've been talking about. So let's talk solutions for this younger generation, other than, okay, pray, worship, those are central things. Worship, pray, be faithful in your homes, live biblical masculinity and biblical femininity in your home. But let's, if we press the gas pedal and talk about actions kind of as the fruit, what fruitful actions of those central, say, heart ethical dimensions ought we to be going after?
Yeah, well, I mean, maybe talk first about some of the things that would be done on the level of politics. The effects of this sexual constitution greatly accelerated after the 90s. The number of sexual harassment cases went way up. The number of sex discrimination cases went way up. And one of the reasons for that is that the 1991 Civil Rights Act increased the amount of damages that could be assigned to those who are so-called guilty of creating hostile work environments or of discrimination in hiring practices. And not to just include like backwards-looking restorative justice, but punitive penalties for emotional damages. And it was only after such like very large potential lawsuits could be successfully waged against companies that they really undertook defensive measures in order to protect themselves. This is when you started to get diversity training. They called it sensitivity training when I was young, by the way. I mean, that ages me a little bit. So that was the early 90s. So I think, putting caps, changing the approach of punitive damages, at least might create more space for businesses to be less involved in the private enforcement of public laws, which is what's kind of happening when you have HR involved in such training and such. And without weakening it, it's going to put great burdens on any institution that would seek to resist it. And so I think that's one of the various ways, but I think it's probably the most important and most maybe doable in the short term that could be accomplished to weaken that particular sexual constitution. But I mean, the things that you're pointing to are cultural, and they point also to the idea that we actually have the space and the freedom to build counter institutions at this point. And so people in governing or running their family lives should pay a lot of attention to who their kids marry. I think that one of the great follies of modernity on this matter is to take parents completely out of the courting process, and parents who are wise to these problems should at least insert themselves to some extent in choice on these matters and help shape, inform the judgment of their kids as they approach very important decisions about marrying. I also think that, building your own institutions so that you can operate within them with reliable people is a very good idea. But I do think one of my favorite books is Anna Karenina, Leo Tolstoy's classic from the 1880s, I think, 1880. And in it, she describes three various ways of boys and girls coming together in marriage. And the third one is called the English way, where boys and girls are left perfectly free to determine who their spouse is going to be. She says this is kind of like playing Russian roulette with a loaded gun. And she could not come to embrace such an idea. And I think we should, at least revisit such trust in the drift that people will take toward a solid marriage over the course of time. So that would be like one big thing, and that has several elements to it, but I think that's a big thing.
Okay, final question for you here would be on the political front. Do you anticipate any victories on this point, or do you think that we're in for several miles of bad road?
I don't know whether to be optimistic or pessimistic on the question. The growing gender gap in voting is a real thing. and single white women especially, but single women are becoming one of the most reliably Democratic voting blocs at nearly 70% to 30%, and which is like a big gap, and I think for at least a decade, I think that's going to have major effects, and I would expect the train to keep rolling in the same direction. But the both pessimistic and optimistic thing is that men are undergoing the same kind of revolution in the opposite direction, and this is also happening all over the world, and not as pronounced, but not like unpronounced. Like it's pretty substantial and measurable. And this has happened in places like Korea, where basically one political party is now the political party of single women, another one is the single party of single men. That's bad for politics. It's bad for the relations between men and women. I wrote about this in another First Things piece called Antinatal Engineering, which was a story about South Korea. And a similar thing, much more mild, is happening here among younger generations. And I think that's a cause, as I say, for some optimism, but also but the gap is like really bad for men and women getting together, and that's the cause for pessimism. So I'm not going to make the problem with prophecies is you're almost always wrong, right? And but I do think that there are. I would not expect the 1991 Civil Rights Act to be confined. And I don't expect the Supreme Court to revisit its equality jurisprudence on these matters. And I don't expect, but I also don't expect things like national mandatory daycare to pass, and which would be kind of an accelerant in this direction. So maybe that speaks to what I think is a holding pattern for a while, and then watching it shake out when some sort of emergency happens.
A nice slow ride into the abyss.
Always the best way to go.
That's right. Scott, it's been great to have you for this interview. Thanks again for taking the time. The article is Compulsory Feminism over at First Things, and you can go to Claremont Institute and find out even more about Scott Yenor, follow his other writings. I think you're on Twitter and those kind of platforms as well. So thanks again for talking today.
Thanks, Jared. My pleasure.